From the Division of Plant Industry and the Florida Department of Agriculture, from our standpoint, John was a fantastic partner. I think he modeled a type of leadership that was, of all things, he put everybody else first. All of his all the faculty members, junior faculty members, students. He did everything he could to try to make sure everybody was successful, including us at the department. Whenever we thought we were going to have emergency programs, for example, we had one year we thought we were going to see a blow up of grasshoppers, and apparently they had done that 1 year prior, or a year prior. And I went out with John in the field, and we drove his car down, and there were a lot of grasshoppers. I've never seen so many. And he says, "Oh, this is nothing. This is absolutely nothing. It gets 100-fold worse than this. So this is nothing for you guys to worry about." So he's done all kinds of stories like that. But without further ado, let me ask Dr. Hugh Smith to please come forward.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hugh Smith. I'm the vegetable entomologist at the Gulf Coast Research and Education Center near Tampa. I was John Capiniera's master's student in the early 90s. I'm going to summarize some of John's achievements. At the latter part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about why John was a great leader and what we have to learn from John about leadership. And I will also explain my title, Dragonflies Draw Flame, because as we will see, John worked on a lot of different insects and other organisms, but he did not work with dragonflies. So John and Marcia Capiniera were from Stratford, Connecticut. That's where they grew up. They met in high school and were together from then on. The pictures that you're going to be seeing of John, I got from Marcia, and I met with her just last week. One of John's first jobs in entomology was draining some of the marshes around his hometown in Connecticut as part of a mosquito control program, and this is a picture from the newspaper back in that time. John went to Southern Connecticut State University to get his BA in biology, which he got in 1970. Here are two pictures from 1970, which you'll remember was the height of the Vietnam War. And on the left, we have John looking like Bob Dylan. John's attitudes towards the Vietnam War were very similar to Dylan's. When his draft number came up, he joined the Army Reserves, and he was in the reserves for 6 years, which was the better part of his time in graduate school. John went to UMass Amherst for his for his master's. He worked with John Lilly, and he worked on asparagus beetle. And here are a couple of the publications that came out of that time. He also worked as a technician at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, and it was during this time working as a technician, John realized that he didn't want to be a technician all his life and that he needed to get a PhD in order to do what he wanted. Can you hear me better now? Okay. And he went back to graduate school again at UMass Amherst, and he worked, his advisor was Pedro Barbosa. And this is a more recent picture of Dr. Barbosa, who moved on to University of Maryland. This is from when he retired, but back in the 70s, Dr. Barbosa was at UMass Amherst. And John worked on Lamantria dispar, which until recently was referred to as gypsy moth. Here are some of the publications that came out from that time. Right after John finished his PhD, he was hired as an assistant professor at Colorado State University. And by 1981, he got tenure, he'd become an associate professor. By 1985, he was chair of the department. So here's a picture that Marcia gave me of John at one of the parks in Colorado. She said he was always happiest in nature. Back in this time, John referred to himself professionally as a naturalist. He used this term until it was co-opted by the nudist movement, and then he had to find a different way to describe himself. I always remember him describing himself as a generalist in terms of what sort of entomologist he was. And those of us who grew up in his program also came to think of ourselves as generalists in the sense that we're here to respond to stakeholder needs. We don't just do biocontrol because we think it's fun, or we don't just, oh, I just do thrips. We're there to respond to stakeholder need. And sort of developing this idea of John as a generalist, this is a table I made going through John's 160 peer-reviewed publications. This is a list of all the pest organisms that he worked on, as were mentioned in the title of the papers. So he had plenty of papers that weren't about pests. He had papers that were about pest groups. But this is a list of some of the many species, and I've put in bold some of the species that he worked on at length. In some of these cases, he just had 1 or 2 publications, but with some of these organisms, he worked for many years in a very comprehensive way. He worked with Coleoptera from the beginning, also quite a bit with Lepidoptera. He's known nationally and internationally as an orthopterist. And then at the bottom, we have the mollusca. In the latter part of his career, he worked a great deal on snails and slugs, recognizing their importance in Florida. So here are some of the Lepidoptera that he worked on. So Hemiluca olivii, range caterpillar, back from his time in Colorado when he worked not just with grasshoppers, but different aspects of range management. In Florida, he worked a lot with Diaphania, with pickleworm and melonworm. I worked, when I was his master's student, I worked on this group, and I asked him, why are you working with Diaphania? And he said, well, when I got here, no one was working on it, so I decided I would start working on it. And that was sort of typical of his response to filling needs. And put in this picture of Xyloborus glabratus. I just picked up from his CV in his latter years. I believe he was on a students committee, but this is a problem in South Florida that he worked on quite a bit towards the end. He is really known as an orthopterist. Here are some pictures of some of the species that he worked on in Colorado and in Florida, but he also worked with Orthoptera as a group. He had field guides and worked quite a bit in taxonomy of Orthoptera. So just kind of looking overall at the themes of some of his research, and again, here we're just looking at journal articles. I'm not talking about his books yet, or his many EDIS publications or extension publications. He did a lot of work he did a lot of feeding studies, and he did a lot of studies of looking at host-plant relations, host-plant effects, defoliation, including simulated effects, anti-feed and phago-repellency. And just from my quick summary of the titles, it was about 25% of what he published had to do with feeding and other host-plant effects. John worked a lot throughout his career with entomopathogenic nematodes, starting from his time back in Colorado and also into his time in Florida. Just about any pest that he worked on at any length, he screened them for susceptibility to entomopathogenic nematodes. He worked with some more obscure species here, but also some other species that we're more familiar with. And here's a photograph from his time at Colorado State with a beneficial nematode on his finger. He worked a lot with snails and slugs in the latter part of his career. He didn't say, I'm an entomologist, that's not what I work on. He recognized the need, and those of us who work in the field get these questions all the time about snails and slugs, and there is a real need for management. And people in the department, Xavier, Lauren, Silvana, have also stepped up and are working with this group. But this is a very important group in Florida and elsewhere. These are some of the species that he worked on during his time in Florida. So this is just a summary of the journals that he published in. I had to delete a bunch of the names just because it got too crowded for the ones that he only had a couple papers in. He published a lot in the Florida Entomologist in his latter years. He was actually editor-in-chief for a number of years of Florida Entomologist. He published a lot in environmental entomology from early on, also Journal of Economic Entomology. But he didn't just publish in entomology journals. John collaborated with people in pathology. He published in plant disease, in phytopathology, weed science, Journal of Organic Chemistry. He published very broadly in different sorts of journals. He authored and co-authored and edited a number of very important books. 12 here we have on the list, starting back in his work in the early 80s in Colorado with grasshoppers. The Handbook of Vegetable Pests, from what I do, is one of the most important publications of his, kind of a Bible, very broadly useful. We've got his Encyclopedia of Entomology there. One that is not pictured is his last book, which was Insects and Wildlife. He was always starting something new. He was always supporting other people who were starting and creating new things and responding to new needs. He received recognition for these books. The Handbook of Vegetable Pests was named an outstanding academic title for for 2001 by Choice magazine. It was also received an award of recognition from the ESA. The Encyclopedia of Entomology was awarded Best Reference by the New York Public Library. And his Field Guide to Grasshoppers, Katydids, and Crickets received a star review from Library Journal. John had 27 graduate students. He graduated 27 graduate students, kind of evenly between Colorado State and Florida, even though he spent much more time at Florida. He had graduated 13 students from Colorado State University and 14 here from UF. And he taught a lot. He taught a lot, starting back from the classes when he was in Colorado and here in Florida. Again, it's important to remember this isn't something that he had to do. And we're going to look at some quotes from people who wrote letters of support for him for his ESA fellow nomination. And one person wrote that John understood entomology departments are there for students. He always put students foremost. These were classes that he developed and taught in many instances repeatedly. In many cases, the courses were taken over by other people, and sometimes if someone retired or left, he would step in and teach the class. He took teaching very seriously. Here's a quote from Wayne Brewer's letter of recommendation for John for his ESA fellow nomination. It's specifically about teaching, and it's referring to 1976. 1976, when John first joined CSU and became involved in teaching one of these classes that Wayne said was very important for the department, and Wayne was worried about the new guy. And I'm just going to read it. I know you can all read it, but I'm going to read it. And the bold that I put in these quotes is emphasis that I've put in. They're not in the original letters. But John quickly demonstrated his abilities as an outstanding communicator and very gifted teacher. His sincere concern for the students came through loud and clear. I learned a great deal about entomology from him, but even more about the art of teaching. I copied many of his approaches and techniques blatantly and stole his jokes. I am a better teacher for having had the opportunity to closely observe a truly great one. And the comment about stealing his jokes resonates because John always said that if you could make people laugh, they would remember what you said. In 1987, he came to Florida. Here's a picture from the Gainesville Sun when we got what was then the new building, and here's a scan of the brochure for the new building, which is just the building for most of us, for most of you. But it's important to remember when John joined UF in 1987, entomology was in the top of McCarty D. It was on the top floor of McCarty, and that building wasn't there. So to try to capture some of what John's done with infrastructure, I'm going to share with you something from Phil Kaler's letter of recommendation. Again, this is back from 1999. The entomology department has arguably the best physical plant of any academic department in the country. Dr. Capiniera helped plan and implement the move of 32 faculty, 40 staff, and equipment from 22 separate buildings into one 88,000 square foot building in 1990. He organized construction of 12,000 square foot of support buildings, including urban entomology, the reading room library, 14 greenhouses, and 2 screenhouses. And of course, now there is considerably more than there was at that time. And I'm just going to drill down a little bit deeper from something in Phil's letter just about the computer lab, the student computer lab. It's available 24 hours a day to those who don't have access to their own computer. This lab has current computer technology. It's one of the most heavily utilized. And this last sentence, I think, is really important. Everyone takes for granted that the computers will be available, someone will fix the problems, and old computers will be replaced. John was constantly creating and recognizing the need for and providing resources. He understood the importance of having a graphics department for us all to be most efficient. He understood the value of having someone who could take high-quality insect photographs. I can go on. These are resources that he brought in, and they're still there. And he was just always doing what he could to make us as efficient as we could be in our jobs. He was instrumental in establishing many new degree programs, some prior to this, pre-professional programs in medical and vet entomology. But these are, I communicated with Heather McCausland recently, and she confirmed he was instrumental in establishing the landscape pest management undergraduate and graduate certificates, urban pest management undergraduate and graduate, pest control technology certificates. He established a cooperative PhD with FAMU in 1995, and also the non-thesis MS degrees entirely online. So I'm showing this picture from Pest Pro magazine again and highlighting the headline on the front, on the cover, John Capiniera making online entomology a study, a reality. So most of you take it for granted that we can do everything remotely. Now it's much more common, but he was a pioneer in this. And talking about pioneering distance education, this is from Heather McCausland, talking about those early years. We taught those first courses on CD, mailed to students, or from a password-protected website. John was the second in IFES after Ramesh Reddy to go entirely distance and self-funded master's degrees. John was also a champion of online course delivery to help faculty at RECs, allowing them to bring their students directly to the RECs without having to spend time in Gainesville for classes. John worked closely with George Agrios to establish the Doctor of Plant Medicine program. Dr. Agrios spearheaded this and was really the one who made it happen. And here's a picture of Dr. Agrios, again from the Gainesville Sun from back in 1999. But I remember how excited John was about this many years ago, about making this happen and the practicality of having this sort of program available. So I could go on about many other, well, I couldn't because I don't have time. But John, he received a lot of awards. He did all sorts of things in extension that I don't have time to go into. So I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit more broadly about why John was a great leader and how he was perceived by others. So here is some text from Pedro Barbosa's recommendation letter for John, John's ESA fellow nomination, which he got in 2000. John has demonstrated an absolutely essential and earnest interest, respect, and concern for the career advancement of his faculty and students while maintaining his own active and meaningful involvement in research, extension, and teaching. His involvement in these endeavors at the highest scholarly level sets a standard that gives him powerful and significant credibility as an administrator. And I'm going to add that in addition to the respect that John felt for faculty and students, he had exactly the same relationship with front office staff, support staff, however you want to refer to them, the people who keep the department running, the nuts and bolts people that we depend on. He recognized the importance of hiring competent people and treating them respectfully and maintaining their options for professional advancement. So here's a nice picture that Marcia gave me of John over at Washington Oak State Park, just south of St. Augustine. And here's a line from Marjorie Hoy's recommendation letter. And I think this is also extremely important. John is one of the most positive and persistent people I have ever met. I suspect his remarkable success in all aspects of his career are due in large part, to these personal qualities. So I'm going to talk a little bit more now from my perspective, building on what Dr. Barbosa said about the concern and what Marjorie Hoy said about the positivity. Because in 2017, the Center for World University Rankings ranked the University of Florida Department of Entomology, it's entomology and nematology, but this was a ranking of Department of Entomology first in the world among more than 26,000 degree granting institutions. Now this picture isn't from them, this is from when the building formerly known as 970 Natural Area Drive was renamed Steinmetz Hall. And John, of course, was not chair in 2017. Blair was chair, but this is an achievement that is the end result of many years of work on John's part. So why did I name it this title, Dragonflies Draw Flame? This is, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. This is the opening of a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. Hopkins was a Jesuit priest and a poet in the Victorian age. And these lines are believed to be observations about the early sunlight catching a view in nature. Why am I bringing a Jesuit poet and priest into a presentation about John Capiniera? John was raised in a Catholic family, but he was not religious in any conventional sense of the term. I asked John a very long time ago about the role of religion in his life, and he said that he thought religion was, quote, a bunch of crap, close quote. And I am deliberately quoting that in all its indelicacy because I want to make very clear that my next comments have nothing to do with being preachy. Okay? Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Jesuit priest and poet who believed that when any created, any aspect of creation was most expressing its uniqueness and individuality, it was most united in Christ. He didn't just believe this about people, he felt this about many aspects of nature: kingfishers, dragonflies, the appearance of the soil when the plow turns it over, the oil coming out of a crushed chestnut, the most mundane things. And this wasn't just a philosophy for Hopkins. It led him to do entirely new things with language and really to transform poetry. I believe John saw us through a similar filter that I've just tried to describe for Hopkins, nothing to do with the religious aspect. I believe John was deeply sensitive to and intensely focused on what was unique about the individuals in his orbit of responsibility, the people he mentored in the broadest sense of the term. John wanted to know who you were, what it was that you and you alone had to do. What were you here on planet Earth to accomplish? And John was laser focused on this unique aspect of our individuality, in part because his role was to help us all be as successful and productive as possible. And he understood that the successes and the productivity of the unit were individual successes. His subject, as much as entomology, was human potential. Now, a lot of unit leaders connect to some degree with their team on this level, but many of us felt seen and heard to a degree with John that we hadn't experienced before or since. And so he lifted us up in a way and let us see aspects of our potential that we hadn't previously seen. So in moving towards concluding comments for this presentation, I just want to share two scenarios about John. In 2000, I was postdocing for Everett Mitchell at CMAVE, and I was working in Gainesville, and I was working a lot with organic growers. 2000 was the year that the National Organic Rule came out, and the USDA stated what could and could not be included in certified organic agriculture. And a number of researchers were upset about some of these guidelines because, for example, they didn't include genetically engineered crops. Also in this year, 2000, Florida organic growers, both in general but also the FOG, the organization, expressed a great deal of unhappiness with IFAS because they felt that IFAS was not really doing anything for them. And John organized a meeting. It was a couple hours drive from Gainesville. I remember exactly where it was, but he organized a meeting with organic growers in order to try to establish dialogue and to start to address some of these issues. And I had been told that this was going to be an angry meeting because growers were angry. And I shared this with John, and he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, "I don't mind if people shout at me," which is kind of remarkable because we all mind if people shout at us, right? And maybe he was so used to being shouted at that point that he didn't care, but I think he understood on a deeper level that they weren't really shouting at him. This was something that he needed to go through. No one shouted at him at the meeting, but it was very, some people were really sort of very condescending and mocking of John, and he didn't care. He just smiled that Capiniera smile and ran the meeting. So fast forward to the end of 2001. I had spent a year on Saipan. I had my first job in the Western Pacific in the Northern Mariana Islands. And if any of you had been to Saipan in that time, it's a U.S. territory in the Western Pacific. If you'd been there at a time, you would see that, or would have experienced that life on Saipan was never boring. Living and working on Saipan was kind of like living in a movie where every scene is based on conflict. It was very difficult to get anything done, and eventually a lot of people just stopped trying. So I was there for a year, and then I left, and I came back, and I was in Gainesville visiting with John in his office. And I was sharing with him some of the things I had experienced. And I said at one point, I said, "John, I realized while I was over there how good you must be at what you do. Because people here in the department, we can just get on with our jobs. People get on with their jobs, and they can get their work done, and they can be productive." And I had no idea how important good leadership was. All the things I've tried to touch on, that John did sort of behind the scenes, you had really had no idea how dependent we were on that sort of thing until it was gone, until you're in kind of a worst case scenario and it's not there. So I said this to John. I just said, I realize you're really good at what you do. And John looked out the window and he started blinking. He was blinking a lot. And I'm looking at him and I realized he was blinking back tears. What I had said had resonated with him on an emotional level. So that's what it took to push John Capiniera out of his comfort zone. Not being shouted at, not being mocked, but simple praise. And I've often wondered, how many of us can say that about ourselves? That we're more comfortable being shouted at or mocked than we are being praised? I know I can't say it about myself. I think most of us go through our days feeling insufficiently recognized. What about me? With John, it was never about him. It was always about you. It was always about other people. I'm sure John had an ego, because we all do, but I never saw it. So I think it's important to keep these lessons in mind of what can be learned from John and what he created with our department. Yes, he was very intelligent. He was deeply caring. He had remarkable abilities. His organizational ability, his time management, his efficiency, they were almost otherworldly. But what tied all these things together with John was his profound caring for the individual and the support he wanted to give each person on their unique journey. I think this is what made John great, and this is what enabled him to turn our department into the best entomology department on planet Earth. I was going to move forward. So I'm going to leave you with this picture of John and his wife Marcia. That's his daughter Erica and Erica's husband Randy back from 2012. And thank you very much for listening. And I believe the next part of this is going to be the master's student presentations, right?